The wind howled through the narrow streets of downtown Chicago, carrying with it the sting of early winter. The city, alive with lights and movement, seemed oblivious to the small, forgotten souls huddled beneath doorways and bridges. The smell of roasted chestnuts and hot coffee from nearby stalls filled the air, a cruel reminder for those who had nothing. Among them was a boy, no older than 11. His name was Ely. His clothes were torn, his hands trembling, his lips cracked from cold. He sat against the wall of an old grocery store, knees pulled to his chest, his thin frame shivering beneath a dirty blanket that barely covered him. People passed by without a glance, some looked away, others quickened their pace. In a city built on ambition and speed, compassion had become a luxury few could afford. Eli hadn't eaten in 2 days. The last thing he'd eaten was half a sandwich someone had thrown away. Now, he watched through the frosted glass of the grocery store as families shopped for Thanksgiving, baskets overflowing with food he could only dream of. Just then, a woman in a red coat stopped nearby. Her name was Grace Morgan, a 35-year-old nurse, recently divorced, trying to rebuild her life. She had just finished a 12-hour hospital shift and was on her way home, exhausted and lost in thought. But something made her stop. Maybe it was the way the boy's small hands trembled, or the distant, defeated look in his eyes. A look she'd seen too many times in her patients. Grace hesitated. People walked around her, annoyed. "Move, lady," someone muttered. But she didn't move. Instead, she took a slow step toward the boy. "Hey there," she said softly, crouching down so her eyes met his. "Are you okay?" Ely looked up, startled. His first instinct was to hide the piece of cardboard he'd written on "hungry." "Please help." He shook his head. "I'm fine," he whispered. His voice was rough, barely audible. Grace frowned. "You don't look fine, sweetheart. When was the last time you ate?" Eli's eyes darted toward the grocery store window, then back to her face. "Yesterday," he lied. Grace could tell he was lying. Years in the ER had taught her how to read people, especially pain. She smiled gently, extending her hand. "Come on, let's get you something warm." He hesitated, unsure if he could trust her. Life on the streets had taught him one thing: kindness often came with conditions. But something in her eyes, warmth, sincerity, made him trust her even for a moment. They walked into a small diner across the street. The waitress frowned when she saw Ely, dirty, barefoot, out of place. Grace caught her look immediately. "He's with me," she said firmly. "2 hot chocolates, and whatever the special is today." The waitress nodded, embarrassed, and disappeared into the kitchen. Eli sat quietly, staring at the table, afraid to make eye contact. Grace noticed how his hands shook as he held the cup when it arrived. Steam rose, and his eyes lit up. Just for a second, before he took his first sip. Then, when the plate of pancakes arrived, he ate like someone who didn't know when he'd see food again. Grace didn't speak. She let him eat. After a few minutes, she said softly, "What's your name?" "Eli." "Where are your parents?" "Illy." He stopped chewing. His fork froze halfway to his mouth. "They're gone," he whispered. "My mom, she got sick. My dad left after that." Grace's heart clenched. She reached into her coat pocket and handed him a napkin. "I'm sorry, sweetheart." He shrugged, pretending not to care, but a tear slipped down his cheek anyway. After they finished, Grace paid the bill and said, "There's a shelter not far from here. I can take you there if you want." Eli shook his head quickly. "No. They're mean there. They take your stuff." Grace bit her lip. She knew some shelters weren't safe. She'd treated too many kids who'd been hurt in places meant to protect them. "Okay," she said finally. "Then at least let me get you some clothes and something to eat later. I'll be right back." But Ely grabbed her hand. "Don't go," he said. His voice trembled with fear, the kind that only comes from too much loneliness. Grace froze. She could feel his small hand gripping hers, desperate and cold. For a long moment she didn't know what to say. Then she smiled and squeezed back. "Okay, I'm not going anywhere." She ended up buying him a pair of boots, a coat, and some snacks from a nearby store. When she handed him the bag, he stared at it like it was treasure. "No one's ever done this for me," he whispered. Grace smiled softly. "Everyone deserves a little kindness, Eli." He looked up at her, his eyes shining with tears. "You're like an angel." Grace laughed gently. "Far from it, kiddo. Just someone who knows what it's like to be lost." When they walked back outside, the city lights flickered against the snow that had started to fall. Grace handed him a card with her name and phone number. "If you ever need anything, food, help, anything, you call me, okay?" Eli nodded and tucked it into his pocket like it was gold. As they parted ways that night, Grace looked back once, just once, and saw him sitting on the same sidewalk, this time wearing the coat she'd given him. He waved shyly. She smiled and waved back, then disappeared into the crowd. Neither of them knew that this small act, a meal, a coat, a moment of kindness, would change both their lives forever. 3 days passed, then a week, then 2. Grace found herself glancing at the same spot every evening as she passed the grocery store. The corner where Ely used to sit. But the boy was gone. At first, she hoped it was a good sign. Maybe he'd found help. Maybe another kind soul had taken him in. But as the days turned into weeks, unease began to settle in her chest like a weight she couldn't shake off. She'd ask around. At the diner, at the shelter, even the police precinct near her hospital, but no one knew a boy named Eli. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Still, Grace carried his memory like a small ache in her heart. Every time she saw a homeless child, every time she treated someone lost or forgotten in the ER, she thought of him. And even though life kept moving, bills to pay, long shifts, a small apartment to maintain, something about that little boy had left a mark on her soul. It was 5 years later when Grace's life changed again. She'd been promoted at the hospital, now working as a senior nurse in the trauma unit. The long hours hadn't gotten easier, but she'd learned to live with the chaos. Patients came and went, some healed, some didn't, and every night she reminded herself that kindness, no matter how small, still mattered. That night, though, was different. The ER doors burst open, and paramedics rushed in with a man on a stretcher. Gunshot wound to the shoulder, one of them shouted. Lost a lot of blood. Grace ran to assist, pulling on gloves, her professional instincts taking over. But as she leaned over the patient, helping stabilize him, she noticed something strange. The man's eyes were filled with terror, not from pain but from something else. He was young, maybe 20. Barely more than a boy. "It's okay," she said, trying to calm him. "You're safe now." He nodded weakly. When she asked for his name, he hesitated. "Eli," he said. Grace froze for half a second, her heart skipping a beat. The name hit her like a flash of lightning. It couldn't be. The boy she'd helped 5 years ago would only be 16 now. This man was older, tougher, and carried the kind of street scars you only got from surviving too much. She shook it off. Coincidence, she thought, and focused on her work. But after surgery, when the patient was stable and asleep, she found herself sitting by his bedside, staring at his face. Something about him felt familiar. Later that night, as she was leaving, she checked on him one last time. His chart listed him as Ellie Thompson, no family contacts, no address. When she leaned in to adjust his blanket, his eyes opened, still groggy from the anesthesia. "Grace," he whispered. She froze. "How do you know my name?" He smiled weakly. "You gave me your card a long time ago." Red coat, pancakes. Her breath caught in her throat. "Eli, it's really you." He nodded, his eyes glistening. "You remembered." She sat down, stunned. "I looked for you for weeks. What happened to you?" Eli stared at the ceiling, his voice low. "After that night I tried to stay clean. But the streets, they don't let you. I got caught up with the wrong people. Stole food to survive. Ran from cops. Slept anywhere I could. Then a man found me one night, said he ran a community program for kids like me. Took me in, gave me a place to sleep, taught me to read, to work. I thought maybe I could be more." Grace felt tears prick her eyes. "You are more, Eli." He smiled faintly. "He was a good man. But a few months ago, I got mixed up with some old friends. One of them got shot. I tried to help him, got hit myself." Grace placed a hand on his. "You're safe now. You've got people who care." He looked at her, emotion flickering across his face. "You cared first." Her throat tightened. She hadn't realized until that moment how much she'd needed to hear that. That her small act so many years ago had meant something. Over the next week, Grace checked on Ellie every day. He recovered faster than anyone expected. He told her stories of the kids he'd met in the shelter, how he wanted to do something good one day. "Maybe open a place for kids like me," he'd say with a hopeful grin. By the time he was discharged, he was walking again. Grace gave him her number once more, writing it on a small sticky note. "Don't disappear again," she said. "I won't," he promised. And for a while he didn't. He called sometimes. Small updates, a new job, a GED program. Grace would smile every time his name appeared on her phone. Then, one day the call stopped. 10 years later. Grace was now in her late 40s, living in a quiet neighborhood outside the city. Her hair had a few silver streaks, but her spirit was the same. She'd devoted her life to caring for others, though she'd never married again. The hospital had become her second home. That winter, the city buzzed with news of a massive tech company called NovaCorp. One that had come out of nowhere and was changing everything from medicine to communication. Its mysterious young founder, a reclusive billionaire in his early 30s, had become a media obsession. Grace didn't pay much attention to the headlines, until one evening she got a letter, handwritten, no return address. Inside was a single line, "I never forgot the woman in the red coat." Eli. Her hands trembled, tears filled her eyes. The letter stayed on Grace's kitchen table for hours. She kept reading it over and over, her heart pounding faster each time her eyes passed over the words, "I never forgot the woman in the red coat." It had been more than 10 years since she'd last seen Eli. 10 years of wondering, worrying, and hoping that the boy she once fed pancakes to had built a better life for himself. Now, it seemed he had, and not just any life. The next morning, Grace walked into the hospital as usual, her shift starting at sunrise. But her mind wasn't on her patients. The letter had shaken something loose inside her. Memories she'd tucked away, hopes she'd convinced herself to stop having. When her shift ended that evening, she found another surprise waiting for her. A sleek black car was parked near the hospital entrance. A luxury sedan that looked wildly out of place among the nurses' old Toyotas and battered Hondas. A driver in a tailored suit stepped out and approached her with a polite smile. "Ms. Morgan?" he asked. Grace hesitated. "Yes." He handed her an envelope. "Mr. Thompson requests your presence for dinner tonight. Transportation will be provided." Her eyes widened. "Mr. Thompson." Then it clicked. "Eli," the driver added. Ichi insisted personally. Grace didn't know what to say. She wanted to refuse after all. Who gets mysterious invitations from billionaires? But something inside her, the same instinct that once made her stop for a hungry boy on a freezing night, told her to go. The car drove her through downtown Chicago toward the lakefront. The skyline glowed against the evening sky, skyscrapers reflected in the icy water. Eventually, they turned into a gated property that seemed straight out of a dream. Glass walls, silver lights, and manicured gardens dusted with snow. Grace stepped out, feeling small and overwhelmed. The front doors opened automatically, revealing a wide marble hallway. A man stood waiting at the end. He looked nothing like the frail boy she remembered, tall, confident, dressed in a dark suit. His hair was slightly tousled, his eyes sharp yet kind. But those eyes, those same deep, searching eyes, she would have known anywhere. "Eli," she whispered. He smiled. "Welcome, Grace." For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was heavy, not uncomfortable but full of everything left unsaid over the years. Then Grace took a small, shaky breath. "You grew up," he laughed softly. "Eventually. Took me long enough." She smiled back, her heart swelling with emotion. "You look incredible. I can't believe this." "I can," he said, walking toward her. "Because of you." They sat in the living room, the Chicago skyline glittering beyond the massive windows. Eli poured her tea himself. No servants, no pretense. "I built this company about 8 years ago," he said. "Started with a small app that helped homeless shelters track food and donations. It caught on, got funded, grew into what's now NovaCorp." Grace raised her brows. "That's amazing." "I had help," he said humbly. "But the idea started because of you." She blinked. He nodded. "That night, when you bought me pancakes, you didn't just feed me. You made me feel human. I realized how one act of kindness could change everything. That moment planted something in me, something that never stopped growing." Grace's eyes softened. "Ali," he smiled gently. "After I left the hospital all those years ago, I got into a mentorship program. The man who ran it, his name was Marcus, taught me business, finance, discipline. I started coding, freelancing, learning everything I could. He died when I was 22 and he left me his savings. I used it to start NovaCorp." Grace listened in silence, her heart swelling with pride. "He must have believed in you." "He did. Just like you did." For a long moment she didn't speak. Then she said quietly, "I didn't do much, Eli. I just tried to help." He looked at her, his voice filled with quiet intensity. "You did everything. No one had ever looked at me the way you did, like I mattered. You gave me hope. You saved me." Grace blinked back tears. "I'm so proud of you." Eli smiled, but there was a flicker of something deeper in his expression. Guilt, maybe. Regret. He looked away for a moment, then back at her. "I owe you more than I can ever repay," he said. "But I've been trying." "What do you mean?" He stood and motioned for her to follow. They walked through the house, past sleek glass walls and soft lighting, until they entered a large office. On the wall hung a framed document, a foundation charter. Grace leaned closer to read it. The Grace Morgan Foundation, dedicated to providing shelter, education, and hope for homeless children across America. Her eyes widened. "What is this?" Eli smiled. "It's yours. Mine. I started it 2 years ago," he explained softly. "I used your name because everything I am started with you. The foundation now funds over 50 shelters nationwide. We've helped over 10,000 kids. Some of them are already in college." Grace covered her mouth, tears spilling freely down her cheeks. "Lee, I don't even know what to say." He stepped closer. "You don't have to say anything. Just know that every life we change is part of your legacy." She looked at him. The boy she once saved, now standing before her as a man who had changed the world. And for the first time in years, she felt something warm bloom inside her chest. Not pride, not surprise, but peace. They spent hours talking that night, about life, about the roads they'd taken, the mistakes, the miracles. Grace told him about her years at the hospital, the loneliness that came after losing touch with family. Eli listened intently, his gaze soft and full of respect. As midnight approached, Eli stood and handed her a small velvet box. "One more thing," he said. Grace frowned, curious. She opened it and gasped. Inside was a gleaming silver key. "What's this?" "It's for your new home," Eli said simply. "A house near the lake. Fully furnished, close to the hospital. It's yours." "Eli, I can't." "Yes, you can," he interrupted gently. "You gave me my life, Grace. Let me give you a piece of comfort in return." Her lips trembled. "You don't owe me anything," he smiled. "Then think of it as a thank you from one survivor to another." Grace stood there, silent, her fingers trembling around the key. Then she did something she hadn't done in years. She hugged him. It wasn't the polite hug of acquaintances, but the deep, wordless embrace of two souls who understood each other beyond words. Ely hugged her back, holding her as tightly as he once had held on to hope. Later that night, after Grace had left, Eli stood by the window alone, looking out at the lights of the city below. He thought of his mother, the one he'd lost to illness. He thought of the nights he'd gone hungry, the bridges he'd slept under, the fear he'd lived with every day. And he thought of that one woman, the nurse in the red coat, who'd stopped when no one else did. He whispered into the quiet air, "Because of you, Grace, I made it." And somewhere across the city in her small apartment, Grace sat on her bed, holding the silver key and smiling through her tears. For the first time in years, she didn't feel alone. The following weeks were a blur of joy and disbelief for Grace. Every day felt surreal. Phone calls from people thanking her for Or Foundation, interviews with journalists, and visits from children whose lives had been changed. She kept insisting she had nothing to do with it, that it was all Eli's doing, but her humility only made her story more powerful. The media called her the nurse who inspired a billionaire. Her photo, standing beside Eli at a charity gala, was printed in newspapers across the country. But beyond the glitz and praise, Grace began to notice something that worried her. Eli looked tired, not the normal kind of tired. This was the kind that sat deep in the eyes, the kind you can't hide behind tailored suits or practiced smiles. It was a cold Thursday morning when she dropped by his office unannounced. The receptionist recognized her instantly and waved her through. When she reached his top-floor suite, she found him sitting by the window, staring out over the city. Papers were scattered across the desk, his phone buzzing nonstop. "Someone looks like they haven't slept," Grace said softly. Ely turned, surprised, then smiled weakly. "Grace, you caught me." She walked closer, noticing the dark circles beneath his eyes. "When was the last time you had a proper meal?" He laughed quietly. "You sound exactly like you did when I was 11. "That's because you still need someone to remind you you're human," she said, taking a seat across from him. "What's going on, Ely?" He sighed, rubbing his temples. "It's the foundation. Someone's leaking internal data. Donation records, financials. Reporters are calling it fraud. They think I'm misusing the funds." Grace's eyes widened. "That's absurd. You'd never." "I know," he interrupted. "But in this world, perception becomes reality faster than the truth. Investors are panicking. The board's calling emergency meetings. The media's circling like vultures." He leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "It's ironic, isn't it? I built this whole company to help people. And now, it's all at risk because someone inside wants to destroy it." Grace reached across the desk and touched his hand gently. "You've faced worse, Eli. You survived the streets. You'll survive this too." He looked at her, his expression softening. "You always make me believe that." The scandal exploded within days. Headlines flooded the internet. Novacorp under investigation for charity fraud. Grace Morgan Foundation tied to financial mismanagement. Reporters camped outside her apartment. She couldn't walk into the hospital without whispers following her. Even though she wasn't involved in any operations, her name was now tied to the chaos. One evening, she came home to find graffiti sprayed on her apartment door. "Gold digger nurse." The words cut deep. She sat inside, lights off, staring at the silver key Eli had given her. It suddenly felt heavier than before. 2 days later she got a call from Eli. His voice was low, strained. "Grace, I need to see you." When she arrived at his house, the atmosphere was tense. Security guards stood outside, news vans lined the street. Inside, Eli sat at the grand dining table surrounded by documents, laptops and legal advisors. He dismissed everyone the moment she entered. "I found out who did it," he said quietly. "Ooh, Marcus's son, the man who raised me. He worked with me for years. I trusted him." Eli's jaw clenched. "He sold confidential data to competitors and falsified transactions to make it look like embezzlement. All for a buyout deal." Grace's heart sank. "I'm so sorry, Eli. I could forgive betrayal," he said, looking up at her. "But dragging your name into it, that I can't." She smiled sadly. "I'll be fine." But she wasn't. The hate messages continued. The hospital suspended her pending investigation. She spent her days sitting in her new home, the one Eli gave her, wondering if maybe her kindness had somehow cursed them both. One evening, there was a knock on the door. When she opened it, Eli stood there. No suit, no entourage, no cameras, just him. His eyes were tired, but there was something fierce behind them. "I'm pulling the plug on Novacorp," he said bluntly. Grace stared at him, stunned. "What? Eli, that's your life's work." He shook his head. "No. It was built on trust, on the belief that good could change the world. If that foundation's cracked, it means nothing. I'd rather start over than let corruption define what we created." She stepped closer, searching his face. "And the foundation?" His voice softened. "It stays, but I'm restructuring it. Every penny will be accounted for publicly, transparency from top to bottom." Grace felt tears well in her eyes. "You're giving up everything." He smiled faintly. "Not everything, just money. I'll rebuild that. But your name, that I'll protect." Before she could respond, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. This is the official clearance notice. The investigation found no wrongdoing on your part. You're in the clear, Grace. She took the paper with trembling hands. Eli, I don't know what to say. He smiled softly. You said it the night you gave me pancakes. Everyone deserves a little kindness, that's what this is. My turn. Over the next months, Eli shut down NovaCorp's major operations, paid off his employees and liquidated his assets to keep the foundation alive. Reporters called him crazy. Investors called him emotional. But the world also saw something they hadn't in a long time, a billionaire who chose people over power. And through it all, Grace stood by his side. She helped restructure the foundation, attended meetings, and comforted the children who'd been afraid their shelters would close. Sometimes she'd catch Eli staring out at the city with that faraway look again, and she'd remind him quietly, "You're doing the right thing." He'd nod and smile, but she could see the exhaustion behind it, the price of fighting for good in a world that profited from greed. One night, after a long day of paperwork, Grace walked into the office and found Eli asleep at his desk. His head was resting on his arm, a half-written speech glowing on the laptop screen. She smiled and covered him with her shawl. Then she read the document. It was a draft for his upcoming address. A message to the public, to the world. Kindness isn't weakness, it's the most powerful investment of all. I was once a boy no one saw. Until someone stopped and said, "You matter." That one moment built everything I am. If I lose everything today but keep that truth alive, then I've lost nothing at all. Grace wiped her tears and closed the laptop softly. Outside, snow began to fall. Slow, gentle flakes against the dark glass. For the first time in months, she felt something shift inside her again. Hope. The scandal had finally begun to cool. Eli's decision to dissolve NovaCorp and rebuild the foundation from scratch had stunned the world. Some called him foolish, others hailed him as a modern-day hero. But behind the public praise there were consequences, ones far heavier than the headlines ever showed. The empire he'd built over a decade was gone. Hundreds of employees were displaced. Partnerships vanished. And with them, nearly all of Eli's personal wealth. Grace noticed the toll almost immediately. He wasn't the same polished, unshakable man who'd once stood at press conferences. His eyes had softened, but they carried a quiet fatigue. He'd traded luxury for purpose. And it was slowly wearing him down. It was a cloudy afternoon when Grace stopped by his new office. A modest building in the heart of a struggling neighborhood, far from the sleek skyscrapers of downtown. The sign on the wall simply read Grace Morgan Foundation. Because everyone deserves a chance. She found Eli sitting at a small wooden desk, sleeves rolled up, surrounded by volunteers and folders. The billionaire aura was gone. He looked normal. Hard at work again. She teased, placing a cup of coffee beside him. He looked up and smiled. "Hey, partner. Well, technically, you're the face of the foundation," he said, grinning. "I just work for you now." As she laughed softly. "If you work for me, you're the most overqualified employee I've ever had." "Maybe," he said. "But I've never been happier." Grace sat across from him, watching as he scribbled notes on funding proposals. She noticed his hand trembling slightly, his knuckles pale. "Eli," she said carefully, "when was the last time you had a checkup?" He looked up, surprised. "You sound like a nurse again." "I am a nurse," she reminded him. "And that hand tremor isn't nothing." He waved it off. "Just stress." But she wasn't convinced. A few weeks later, during a fundraising event at one of their shelters, Eli collapsed. One moment he was shaking hands with donors, the next, he was on the floor, gasping for breath. Panic erupted in the room. Grace was the first to reach him. "Stay with me," she cried, pressing 2 fingers against his pulse. It was erratic, weak. Paramedics rushed in, sirens blaring as they sped him to the same hospital where Grace had spent half her life saving others. Hours passed before a doctor emerged from the ICU. Grace stood in the hallway, her hands trembling. "Are you family?" the doctor asked. She nodded. "Closest thing he has." The doctor sighed. "He's stable for now, but we found signs of an advanced heart condition. It's genetic. The stress he's been under didn't help. He'll need surgery. Soon." Grace closed her eyes, trying to steady herself. "Can he recover?" "With rest maybe. But he'll have to slow down, significantly slowing down." The one thing Eli never did. When he finally woke up, the first thing he saw was Grace sitting beside his bed, holding his hand. "You scared me," she whispered. He smiled faintly. "Guess I needed a dramatic way to take a day off." "This isn't funny, Eli," he sighed. "I know, I just didn't want you to worry." "Well, too late for that." They sat in silence for a while. Machines beeped softly in the background. Outside, the city lights blinked through the window. After a few minutes, Grace spoke again. "The doctors say you need surgery, and rest, real rest." He looked away. "I can't, there's too much to finish." "The new youth center, the education program." "Ali," she interrupted gently but firmly. "You can't save the world if you kill yourself trying." He turned back toward her, eyes full of something she hadn't seen before. "Fear." "Grace, if I let it all fall apart, what was it all for?" She reached for his hand. It was for them. The kids, the shelters, the lives you already changed. That doesn't disappear just because you need to rest. His voice softened. You always know what to say. I've had practice, she said with a small smile. I used to talk stubborn people out of dying for a living. He chuckled weakly, then winced at the pain. She brushed his hair back gently. For the first time, she noticed how young he still looked when the weight of the world wasn't crushing him. Days turned into weeks. Eli's surgery was scheduled, and Grace refused to leave his side. She moved into the hospital's guest quarters, spending her days managing foundation calls and her nights sitting by his bed, reading to him, or simply holding his hand while he slept. One evening he woke to find her dozing off in a chair, a blanket draped over her shoulders. He smiled faintly. She looked peaceful and tired. He realized she'd sacrificed her own health to care for him. He whispered softly, Grace, you saved me twice now. She stirred. Go back to sleep, Eli. But he kept staring at her. You've been my guardian angel since I was a boy. Her eyes met his, full of warmth and quiet affection. Maybe, but angels don't take credit, remember? He smiled and closed his eyes again. Then I'll take the blame, for never saying thank you properly. The surgery came and went. It was long, complicated, and dangerous. Grace sat outside the operating room, clutching her hands together, whispering prayers she hadn't said in years. When the doctor finally emerged, she stood instantly. He's alive, the doctor said. It was close, but he made it. Grace let out a shaky breath and covered her face with her hands. Tears of relief streamed down her cheeks. She visited him later that night. He was pale but breathing steadily. Machines hummed quietly beside him. She sat beside his bed and whispered, You're gonna be okay, Eli. You have to be. And for a moment, she thought she saw the corners of his mouth lift in a faint smile, even in sleep. Weeks later, Eli began walking again. Slowly at first, then stronger each day. Grace stayed with him through it all. They'd sit on the hospital balcony in the evenings, watching the sunset over the skyline. Do you ever think? Eli said one night. That maybe life's just one long circle. She glanced at him. How do you mean? I started on the streets with nothing, he said softly. Then I gained everything, lost it all again. And somehow, I ended up right where I began, but with you still beside me. Grace smiled faintly. That's not a circle, Eli. That's coming home. He looked at her for a long moment, then quietly said, You know, I used to dream about finding you again. When I was still poor, I'd imagine walking up to you one day, rich, confident, and saying thank you. But when it finally happened, I realized you never cared about that part. She laughed softly. You figured that out late. He grinned. Yeah, I was a slow learner. The two of them sat in silence after that, the golden light of sunset painting their faces. There was peace, rare, delicate, and real. For the first time in years, Eli wasn't thinking about saving the world. He was simply living it. The morning light filtered softly through the curtains of Ellie's modest apartment, spilling across the oak floorboards. Outside, the city hummed awake. Taxis honked, vendors shouted, and the smell of coffee drifted through the streets. Grace arrived early, as always, carrying a small paper bag and 2 cups of coffee. Eli opened the door, leaning on his cane but looking healthier than he had in months. You're early, he said, smiling faintly. I figured you'd try sneaking out to work again, she replied, raising an eyebrow. And you're not cleared yet. He chuckled. You know me too well. I should, she said. I've been keeping you alive since you were 13. He laughed, a warm, genuine laugh that filled the quiet apartment. She set the coffee on the counter and handed him the bag. Breakfast. Doctor's orders, she said. He peeked inside. As that. Blueberry muffins. The ones you used to steal from the hospital cafeteria. He grinned, nostalgic. Those muffins probably saved my life. Grace gave him a knowing look. No, Eli. Kindness did. It had been 6 months since his surgery. 6 months of rebuilding both his body and his purpose. NovaCorp was gone, but in its place had risen something greater. The Horizon Project, a network of learning centers, clinics, and shelters across the country. Instead of profit margins, it ran on one core belief: every act of kindness can build a future. Eli no longer sat behind corporate desks. He visited shelters, talked to kids, shared stories, and quietly funded programs under other people's names. He wanted the world to see not a billionaire's legacy, but a movement anyone could join. The foundation grew faster than he expected. Volunteers poured in, doctors, teachers, former employees, even street kids he'd once helped. And every time someone asked where the idea came from, Eli gave the same answer. From a woman who believed one small act could change a life. Grace always blushed when she heard it. One evening, they stood on the rooftop of the new Horizon Center, a glass building with a garden that overlooked the city. Below, a crowd gathered for the opening ceremony. The air buzzed with excitement. Eli looked down at them, his eyes glistening. You know, he said softly, when I used to sleep under bridges, I used to stare at the lights of buildings like this. I thought people in there must be so happy, so perfect. But now that I'm here, I realize the light doesn't come from the glass or steel. Grace smiled. No, it comes from the people inside. He turned to her. From people like you. She looked away, blinking back tears. You always say that. Because it's true. A hush fell over the rooftop as the host below called his name. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Eli Carter. He took a deep breath and walked to the microphone. The crowd erupted into applause, cameras flashing, children waving small banners with the Horizon logo. He raised a hand silencing them. When I was a boy, he began, I didn't have much. No family, no home, not even food most nights. But one day, a woman stopped on a cold winter street and gave me something far more valuable than money. She gave me hope. The crowd listened, completely still. She didn't know who I was or what I'd become. She just saw a starving boy and decided he mattered. His voice trembled slightly. That moment saved my life. And everything you see here today, every center, every job, every life we've helped, it started with her kindness. The camera panned toward Grace, who stood in the crowd, tears streaming down her face. Eli smiled at her. So tonight, he said, I dedicate this foundation not to wealth or success, but to her, to Grace Morgan, and to everyone who believes kindness is still worth fighting for. The applause that followed wasn't polite. It was thunderous. People stood, clapped, cheered. Grace covered her mouth, overwhelmed. Eli stepped back from the microphone, eyes glistening, and mouthed 2 words toward her. Thank you. Later that night, after the crowd had gone, they sat together in the rooftop garden, surrounded by quiet and city lights. You didn't have to do that, Grace said softly. Yes, I did, he replied. The world deserves to know your story. She looked at him, her expression tender but firm. Ali, I didn't save you so you could spend your life paying me back. He smiled faintly. I know. But you gave me something I can't return. The least I can do is pass it on. Grace tilted her head, studying him. You're different now, not just richer or wiser, calmer. He nodded. When I was younger, I thought success meant proving I was worth something. Now I realize I was always worth something. You just saw it before I did. She smiled through tears. You've come a long way from that, Ali. And I wouldn't change a thing, he said. Over the next few years, the Horizon Project grew into a global movement. Centers opened across Europe, Canada, and the UK. Celebrities donated. Schools adopted the curriculum, and governments modeled their community programs after it. But Eli remained humble. He still lived simply, visited shelters, and mentored children who reminded him of himself. One of them, a boy named Marcus, had been found sleeping near the same train station Eli once called home. Grace had discovered him one rainy night, just as she'd found Eli all those years ago. Eli took the boy under his wing, teaching him about business, kindness, and resilience. Marcus was bright, hungry to learn. One evening after tutoring, Marcus asked, Mr. Eli, can I ask you something? Of course. Why do you do all this? You're already famous and rich. You could just retire. Eli smiled, glancing at Grace across the room. Because once someone didn't walk away, and I promised I'd never walk away either. Time moved gently after that. Grace retired from nursing and worked full-time at the foundation. Her health began to slow her down, but her spirit remained strong. Eli, though older, seemed content, as if the fire that once drove him to chase success had been replaced by something softer, steadier gratitude. Every year, on the anniversary of the night they met, he and Grace visited the same alley where she'd first found him. It had been transformed into a small park. Clean green, with a plaque that read, "No act of kindness is ever wasted." They'd sit there for hours, watching children play. You know, Grace said one evening, if someone had told me that night that a shivering boy in a hoodie would one day change the world, I would have thought they were crazy. Eli laughed quietly. Maybe you were crazy. The good kind. She smiled. I'll take that. He turned to her, serious now. Grace, everything I've done, all of it, started because you believed in me. I just hope I've lived up to that. She reached over and squeezed his hand. You didn't just live up to it, Eli, you magnified it. You turned one act into a million. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in gold and crimson. For a long while, they sat in silence. Two souls bound by a moment of kindness that had rippled across decades. And as the first stars appeared above the city, Grace whispered, "You kept your promise." Eli smiled, his eyes reflecting the fading light. No, we did. The years had been kind to Grace, kind, but not endless. Her hair had turned silver, her walk slower, her voice softer. Yet there was still something radiant about her presence, a warmth that no age could dim. She had spent the last decade beside Eli, watching the Horizon Project grow from a dream into a movement. Together, they had built schools, homes, and hospitals. Together, they had saved lives. But even the strongest light eventually begins to flicker. It started one autumn morning. Grace was sorting donation boxes in the foundation's storage room when she suddenly felt dizzy. The ground tilted beneath her feet, the world blurred. A sharp pain struck her chest, and before she could call out, everything went dark. When she awoke, she was in a hospital bed. The same hospital where she'd once nursed hundreds back to health. The irony wasn't lost on her. Eli sat beside her, eyes red and tired. You scared me, he said quietly. She smiled faintly. Wes, it's my turn to make you worry. He tried to smile, but his voice cracked. The doctors say it's your heart. You should have told me you weren't feeling well. She reached for his hand. Ali, I didn't want to stop working. Helping others keeps me alive. He squeezed her hand gently. But I need you to stay alive for real. Grace looked into his eyes. The same eyes she'd seen filled with hunger, fear, hope, and finally wisdom. Ali, we've done so much good. Even if I don't make it, it'll all keep going. You'll keep it going. He shook his head, tears threatening to spill. Not without you. Yes, she whispered, smiling faintly. Because kindness doesn't die when people do. It lives in those they've touched. Days turned into weeks. Eli barely left her side. He brought her flowers every morning, always lilies, her favorite. He read to her from old poetry books she loved, sometimes stumbling over the words when emotion caught in his throat. At night, when the nurses dimmed the lights, they'd talk about the past. The alley, the foundation, the people they'd helped. Do you remember that little boy in Detroit? She asked one evening. Eli smiled. Marcus. Yeah, he's in college now, business major. Says he wants to change the world like Mr. Eli. Grace chuckled softly. I like that. You've created ripples. He nodded, though his smile wavered. You started them. She closed her eyes for a moment, her breathing shallow. Eli, promise me something. Anything. When I'm gone, don't build statues, don't make memorials, just keep helping people, that's all I want. His voice was barely a whisper. I promise. A few days later, Grace fell into a quiet sleep and didn't wake up. Eli sat beside her, her hand in his, as the monitors slowly went silent. The room felt impossibly still, like the world itself had stopped to honor her. He didn't cry right away. He just sat there, staring at her peaceful face, remembering the night she had saved his life. The cold, the hunger, the touch of her hand. It all came rushing back. He whispered, you found me when no one else would, and I'll keep finding others because of you. The funeral was small, just a handful of friends, staff from the foundation, and children she'd helped over the years. It was held at a park bench overlooking the same city she'd given her life to. Instead of a casket, Grace had requested her ashes be scattered near the Horizon Center garden. Let the flowers feed on me, she'd written in her will, so life can keep growing. Eli fulfilled every wish. He stood by the fountain, holding a small urn, his hands trembling. Marcus stood beside him, tears in his eyes. Eli spoke softly, his voice breaking. She didn't just save a boy. She saved the man that boy became. And through him she saved thousands more. He tilted the urn and watched as the ashes floated away on the breeze, sparkling in the afternoon light. In the months that followed, Eli threw himself into work. Not to escape grief but to honor it. He restructured the foundation to focus on mentoring and education, especially for children without families. He also created something new. The Grace Initiative, a scholarship program for nurses and caregivers who dedicated their lives to helping others. At the center of every Horizon campus he built a small garden filled with lilies. In each garden stood a simple plaque that read, "Kindness began here." He never mentioned her full name publicly. He didn't have to. Everyone in the foundation knew who Grace was. Her story had become a legend whispered among volunteers. The woman who fed a starving boy who would one day feed the world. 5 years later, Eli stood backstage at a massive global conference in London. The Horizon Project had become a symbel of hope across continents. He was scheduled to deliver the keynote speech. As he adjusted his tie, he felt a tug at his sleeve. It was Marcus, now a young man in his 20s, confident, sharp-eyed, wearing a Horizon pin on his lapel. Nervous, Marcus asked. Eli smiled faintly. Always, should be proud, you know. Marcus said. Grace. Eli's throat tightened. Yeah, I hope she knows. I think she does. The lights on stage flickered. A host announced, "Please welcome Mr. Eli Carter." The applause was thunderous as he stepped onto the stage. He looked out at the crowd. Thousands of faces, young and old, from every corner of the world. Cameras flashed, banners waved. But all he saw was one face, the woman who had believed in him when no one else had. He began to speak. "When I was 13, I was hungry, not just for food, but for hope. A stranger fed me that night. She gave me bread, yes, but she also gave me a reason to live. And because of her, I learned that kindness can outlive us all." The crowd was silent, hanging on his every word. "She taught me that you don't need power or wealth to change the world. You just need compassion, and the courage to act on it." Her name was Grace. And this, all of this, is her legacy. He gestured toward the massive screen behind him. It lit up with a simple image, a black and white photograph of a smiling nurse holding a child. The entire audience stood. Applause thundered through the hall. Eli stepped back, blinking through tears, his heart full. Grace's story had finally reached the world, not as tragedy, but as a promise kept. Later that evening, he walked alone through the gardens outside the conference hall. The moonlight shimmered on the pond, the air crisp with the scent of lilies. He stopped beside one of the plaques. "Kindness began here." He knelt down and whispered, "You see, Grace, they remember." The wind rustled through the flowers, gentle, soft, almost like an answer. And for the first time in years, Eli didn't feel alone. He stood up, placed a hand over his heart and smiled. The world was still full of pain, still full of hunger, but also full of grace. The years rolled gently onward like a calm tide washing over the edges of memory. The Horizon Project had become a worldwide movement, spanning continents, languages, and generations. It was no longer just an organization, it was a philosophy: kindness first, always. And at the center of it all was Eli Carter. No longer the billionaire savior or the boy from the streets, but a teacher, mentor, and storyteller whose quiet wisdom had touched millions. But time, as always, demanded its due. A new dawn. Eli was in his 70s now. His once dark hair had turned a soft silver, his step slower, but his spirit was as bright as ever. He lived in a small house by the sea, peaceful, sunlit, with a garden full of lilies that swayed in the ocean breeze. Marcus often visited. He had grown into a strong, compassionate man. The kind of leader who didn't need to shout to be heard. On this particular morning, Marcus arrived early, carrying a folder under his arm. "Morning, Mr. Carter," he said, stepping onto the porch. Eli looked up from his chair, smiling. "Marcus, my boy, you look like trouble carrying paperwork." Marcus laughed. "Good trouble. We just opened the Horizon Academy in Nairobi. The kids there are already calling it the School of Hope." Eli's eyes softened. "That's beautiful. There's more," Marcus added, handing him the folder. "The Global Kindness Index just published their report. Horizon centers are now active in over 60 countries. We've impacted more than 100 million lives." Eli flipped through the pages slowly, his hands trembling slightly, his eyes glistened. 100 million, he whispered. "Grace would have loved this." Marcus nodded. "She'd be proud. You made sure her legacy never faded." Eli smiled faintly. "We made sure." The quiet before the storm that night, the two of them sat on the porch, watching the sun sink into the horizon, orange melting into violet, waves whispering against the shore. "Marcus," Eli said after a long silence, "I want to talk to you about the future." Marcus frowned slightly. "You mean Horizon?" Eli nodded. "It's time. I've carried the torch long enough. You've got the vision now. The next chapter should be yours." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "I can't imagine Horizon without you." Eli chuckled softly. "That's what I said about Grace. But she never really left, did she? Every child we feed, every shelter we build, she's right there." Marcus's voice was quiet. "You'll always be too." Eli looked out at the sea, his eyes reflecting the dying light. "One day, people will forget my name, but if they remember what we stood for, if they choose kindness over indifference, that's all I want." The wind rustled through the lilies beside the porch. It felt like an answer from another time. The final letter. A few months later, Eli's health began to fade. He didn't fight it, not with fear, not with regret. He simply smiled through the pain, grateful for the years he'd been given. Grace had once told him, "We don't live forever, Eli, we just live enough to pass the flame." He understood now what she meant. One evening as Marcus visited, Eli handed him a sealed envelope. "For after I'm gone," he said. Marcus tried to protest, but Eli shook his head gently. "It's not goodbye, son. It's a reminder." A week later, Eli passed away peacefully in his sleep. The same gentle smile on his face that Grace once saw when she fed him that first piece of bread so many decades ago. The world mourned. News outlets ran stories titled "The Man Who Built Kindness," and "From Homeless Boy to Global Hope." But those who truly knew him, the volunteers, the children, the dreamers, didn't speak of loss. They spoke of light. The letter. Marcus opened the envelope during a quiet sunrise at Eli's favorite bench by the sea. Inside was a single page, handwritten in Eli's graceful, slightly shaky script. "Marcus, if you're reading this, it means my journey's done. But yours is only beginning. I was saved by a woman who believed a starving boy mattered. She didn't ask for thanks or fame, she just gave me hope. Everything I've done since then, every smile, every home, every life, belongs to her as much as to me. Now it belongs to you. Don't chase the numbers. Don't measure success by buildings or headlines. Measure it by the quiet moments, the child who laughs again, the stranger who smiles, the life that breathes easier because of your compassion. And when the weight feels heavy, look for grace, not the woman, but the word. The kindness in others, the spark that never dies. Carry it forward, my son. Pass the flame, with love, Eli." Marcus folded the letter carefully, tears slipping down his cheeks. He looked out over the water and whispered, "I will." The next generation. 10 years later, the Horizon Project had become something far beyond even Eli's imagination. It wasn't just an organization, it was a global network of kindness, fueled by ordinary people doing extraordinary things. One day at a small Horizon Center in Chicago, a teenage girl named Lily, homeless, hungry, scared, stumbled through the doors. A volunteer saw her and offered a warm meal. "Don't worry," he said gently. "You're safe here." She sat, trembling, eating slowly. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. The volunteer smiled. "Because someone once helped a boy who was just like you. And he taught us all what that means." On the wall behind them hung a photo of Eli and Grace, smiling side by side, surrounded by children. Beneath it, the same inscription appeared in dozens of languages: "No act of kindness is ever wasted." Epilogue. The ripple lives on across the world. In Nairobi, Toronto, Karachi, and Dublin, Children studied under the banner of Horizon. Doctors volunteered in free clinics. Farmers shared food. Strangers helped strangers, and though Ellie and Grace were gone, their story continued to move through every act of compassion, a ripple that never stopped expanding. One night, in that same Chicago center, Lily stood at the window looking out into the rain. She saw a small boy shivering in the alley below. Hungry, scared, just as she once was. Without hesitation, she grabbed her coat and ran outside. "Hey," she said softly, kneeling beside him. "Are you okay?" He shook his head. She smiled gently and held out her hand. "Come on, let's get you something to eat." As they walked through the rain, the boy glanced up at her. "Why are you helping me?" She smiled, eyes glistening. "Because once someone helped me too." And in that moment, under the falling rain in a quiet corner of a vast city, the ripple began again. The promise lived on. The morning sun poured through the grand windows of the Carter Foundation for Hope. Outside, reporters gathered, their cameras clicking, waiting for the ribbon-cutting ceremony of one of the largest charitable organizations in the country. The air buzzed with excitement, but inside the building, the mood was calm, almost sacred. Clara stood quietly in the front hall, wearing a simple cream dress and a cardigan. Her gray hair was pulled into a neat bun, and her eyes sparkled with both humility and disbelief. Around her were photographs. Images of children she'd helped through the years, families who'd found shelter, and countless smiles born from second chances. And in the center of it all was a plaque that read, "Dedicated to Clara Evans, whose kindness sparked 1,000 tomorrows." Clara traced her fingers over the engraved words, tears filling her eyes. "I don't deserve all this," she whispered. Behind her, a familiar voice replied softly, "You deserve more than I could ever give." She turned, and there he was. Ethan, the boy she had once found starving in the rain, now standing tall and confident, the weight of his success resting easily on his shoulders. But behind his composure, his eyes were filled with something deeper than pride, reverence. Ethan stepped closer, holding a small wooden box in his hands. "There's something I never got to give you," he said. Clara smiled through her tears. "Ethan, you've already given me more than enough. Please," he said quietly, opening the box. Inside was a delicate silver necklace, its pendant shaped like a heart intertwined with an infinity symbol. "I had this made after I found you again," he explained. "The heart represents you, the love that saved me. The infinity symbol represents how your kindness will never end." Clara's lips trembled. "Oh, Ethan." He fastened the necklace around her neck, his hands shaking slightly. "I used to think success meant money or fame," he continued. "But standing here, I realize it means giving someone else what they once gave you, hope." Clara's voice softened. "You already had that hope in you, Ethan. You just needed someone to remind you it was there." Ethan looked around the foundation's gleaming halls, his throat tight. "You reminded me when no one else saw me. Now I want the world to see you." The doors opened, and the press event began. Cameras flashed as Ethan took the stage, his speech broadcast live across multiple networks. He stood behind the podium, adjusting the microphone, then glanced toward Clara sitting in the front row. "When I was a boy," he began, his voice steady but emotional, "I was hungry, not just for food but for someone to believe in me. I was lost, cold, and forgotten. And then, one woman, just one, decided I was worth saving. She didn't see a beggar, she saw a human being." The crowd grew silent. "She gave me a sandwich, a place to rest, and words that changed my life. I promised myself that if I ever made it, I'd come back for her, not because I owed her, but because love like that should never be forgotten." He paused, looking directly at Clara. "This foundation isn't mine, it's hers. Every meal, every bed, every opportunity we offer here will carry her spirit forward, because one act of kindness can ripple through generations." The audience rose to their feet, clapping and cheering, but Ethan barely noticed. His eyes never left Clara's. She was crying openly now, hands trembling, her heart too full for words. After the ceremony, as people gathered around them for photos and interviews, Clara leaned close to him and said softly, "You made me proud long before today, Ethan. But this is something else." He smiled, holding her hand. "No, Clara, you made me who I am." Later that evening, when the crowd had dispersed and the foundation halls had quieted, Clara and Ethan sat side by side on a bench outside the building. The city skyline shimmered before them, reflecting the colors of twilight. "I used to come here when I had nothing," Ethan said, gazing at the streets below. "I'd sleep under that old bridge and dream about being someone. I never thought I'd be sitting here like this, with you." Clara chuckled gently. "I didn't think I'd live to see it either." He turned to her, his expression serious. "You know, I built this place for the kids who were like me. But I also built it for the people like you. The ones who give when no one's watching." Clara leaned her head on his shoulder, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's the only kind of giving that really matters." They sat in silence for a while, watching the city lights flicker to life. Somewhere in the distance a child's laughter echoed. A sound that carried through the night like music. And in that moment, neither of them spoke, because they didn't need to. The story had already been written. The story of a starving boy, a compassionate woman, and the miracle that kindness can create when it's given without expectation. The wind rustled softly through the trees, carrying with it the scent of rain and hope. Ethan reached for Clara's hand again, holding it gently, as if anchoring himself to the person who had once anchored him. And as the stars began to appear overhead, one thing was certain: what began as a simple act of compassion had turned into something eternal. A legacy of love that would never fade. The night sky over New York shimmered with 1,000 city lights, each one reflecting the heartbeat of countless lives. Inside the Carter Foundation's rooftop garden, the air was filled with quiet conversation, soft laughter, and the glow of candlelight. The Foundation's grand charity gala had ended, but a few people lingered. Those closest to Ethan Carter and the woman who had unknowingly started it all. Clara Evans sat in her wheelchair, wrapped in a warm shawl. The years had softened her body but not her spirit. Her eyes still shone with that same light Ethan had seen all those years ago. The light of compassion, of belief, of grace. Ethan stood near the balcony, looking out at the city below. His tuxedo fit perfectly, but his gaze wasn't on the glittering skyline or the success surrounding him. It was on the memory of a cold night in a back alley when a woman had offered him a sandwich, a blanket, and something even rarer: dignity. He turned when he felt her presence beside him. "You shouldn't be out here, Clara. It's chilly." She smiled, her voice thin but warm. "You always say that, but I like the air. Reminds me I'm still here." He laughed softly and pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders. "You're more than just here, Clara. You're everywhere now. Every child who eats tonight, every family who sleeps in our shelters, they carry your kindness with them." She reached out and took his hand, her wrinkled fingers trembling slightly. "No, Ethan, they carry our kindness. You are the one who made it grow. You were the seed and I just gave it a little soil." He smiled. That same humble, boyish smile she'd seen when he was just a lost soul in the rain. "You gave me more than soil, Clara. You gave me life." They stood together in silence, the city hum filling the spaces between their words. Then Clara whispered, almost to herself, "Do you ever think about that night?" "Every day," Ethan said without hesitation. "Sometimes I still wake up and smell that old soup kitchen air. I can still hear the rain hitting the tin roof. And then I remember you. You telling me, you're not invisible. Ethan, that's when my life started." Clara's lips trembled with emotion. "Funny, isn't it? I thought I was just helping a boy through one bad night. And you were," he said softly. "You just didn't know it would last forever." The door opened behind them. A young boy, maybe 10 years old, peeked out shyly. "Mr. Carter." Ethan smiled and knelt down. "Hey kiddo. Shouldn't you be in bed?" The boy grinned sheepishly. "I couldn't sleep. I wanted to thank you for letting me stay here." Ethan glanced at Clara, then back at the boy. "You never have to thank me. Just promise me one thing, okay?" "What?" the boy asked. "When you see someone who needs help, someone invisible to the world, you stop, you listen. You give them what you can, even if it's just kindness." The boy nodded seriously, then looked at Clara. "That's what she did for you?" "Huh?" Ethan smiled, eyes glistening. "Exactly what she did." The boy hesitated, then reached into his pocket and handed Clara a small paper flower he had folded himself. "For you," he said softly. Clara took it carefully, her old hands trembling as she held the fragile creation. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Thank you, sweetheart." The boy smiled and ran back inside, leaving Ethan and Clara alone again. Tears welled in Clara's eyes as she looked at the paper flower. "It's strange, Ethan. Sometimes the smallest acts come back around, don't they?" Ethan nodded, emotion tightening his throat. Full circle. They watched the lights together, the stars above and the city below merging into one. After a long pause, Clara said quietly, "You know, I think I'm ready." Ethan turned to her, concerned. "Ready for what?" She smiled gently, her hand resting over his. "To rest. I've seen what I needed to see. The boy I helped became the man who changed the world." He swallowed hard. "Don't talk like that, Clara. I still need you." Her eyes softened. "No, Ethan. You don't need me anymore. The world does. And it has you." The night deepened. The city's hum seemed to fade into silence as they sat side by side, her hand still in his. Hours later, when the first light of dawn touched the sky, the rooftop garden was quiet. The candles had burned out. A soft wind moved through the flowers. Ethan sat there holding Clara's hand, still warm, still peaceful. She looked as though she were simply sleeping. There was no fear, no pain, only peace. He didn't cry right away. He just sat with her, his heart aching but full. Because even in her final moment, Clara had given him one last gift. The strength to carry her light forward. Later that morning, when people gathered to honor her, Ethan stood before them once again. But this time his voice trembled with emotion he could barely contain. "She was my guardian angel," he said softly. "And I will spend the rest of my life making sure her love never dies." Years later, a statue was placed in the foundation's courtyard. Of a woman bending down to offer food to a boy. The plaque beneath it read, "Kindness never asks who you are. It only asks, how can I help?" And every night, as the city lights flickered and the stars began to shine, those who passed by could feel it. The quiet, eternal echo of a single act of compassion that changed the world forever. Because even when one life ends, love, real, selfless love continues to grow forever.